There's a type of discomfort that's quiet on the surface, no loud scandals, no dramatic explosions, no clear betrayals. Instead, it's the subtle feeling that the places where you once moved with ease just don't fit the same way anymore. Conversations still go on, group chats still buzz, and invitations might still arrive. But inside, something tightens rather than relaxes. You still smile, respond, and show up, but beneath it all is a quiet exhaustion that's hard to put into words. Here's a truth many shy away from saying out loud. What if stepping away from the crowd isn't evidence that you're lost, but the first sign that something inside you is finally waking up? That idea unsettles people, especially in Christian communities where togetherness is often treated as an unquestionable good. Community matters deeply. Scripture never mocks it. Yet, the Bible also refuses to pretend that every crowd is healthy, every belonging holy, or every closeness aligned with God's truth. Sometimes, God doesn't bless a woman by surrounding her. Sometimes He begins by separating her not to shame or punish, but to make space for her to hear what had been drowned out. Stick with me here, because what happens when a woman is no longer held together by group expectations might be one of the most misunderstood parts of spiritual growth. Once you recognize this pattern, you'll start seeing it throughout Scripture, in life, and maybe even in your own story. Let's start slowly. This part can be easily oversimplified. There comes a moment when belonging costs more than it gives. Not always because the people are bad or something toxic happened openly. Often, it's much quieter. She notices how much energy she spends staying legible to others, constantly adjusting her tone, editing her reactions, softening her convictions, anticipating how something will be received. The room might still accept her, but she no longer breathes freely within it. This kind of strain is hard to explain because from the outside, everything appears fine. Scripture understands this tension better than most realize. It repeatedly places transformation near interruption. Before a public calling, there's often withdrawal. Before clarity, silence. Before authority, distance. Think of the wilderness stories, not cliches, but real environments where identity is tested when usual structures fall away. In the ancient world, belonging wasn't a lifestyle choice, it was protection, survival, and continuity. Being separated from a collective rhythm was destabilizing. Yet, biblical narratives return to this theme again and again. God leads people into spaces where the crowd cannot carry them. This doesn't feel spiritual at first. Usually, it feels awkward. A woman steps back by choice, or because life pulls her away, and first she feels not freedom, but emptiness. Too much time. Too much silence. Thoughts long postponed come bubbling up. Without the steady flow of opinions, reactions, and social upkeep, she hears her own inner life more clearly, and that can be unsettling. Even the body reacts. Restlessness rises. The urge to check her phone becomes stronger. A subtle anxiety creeps in. It feels like something is missing. But maybe what's missing isn't life, it's anesthesia. The Bible doesn't romanticize this stage. It doesn't say solitude immediately feels holy. Often, it feels exposing. Elijah doesn't encounter God amidst a grand spectacle. He meets him exhausted, stretched thin, emotionally raw. God's presence comes not through thunder and fire, but through a voice so soft it almost breaks. This matters, because it means when the noise ends, the first feeling is often vulnerability, not comfort. In everyday life, this shows up in small ways. Responses slow down. Decisions become less impulsive. She realizes how many choices used to be made in dialogue with the crowd, not in honest alignment with God. This awareness can bring mental and emotional clarity over time, but at first, it is simply draining. The Bible never promises immediate emotional reward for stepping back. It offers something else: awareness. And awareness can feel like a mercy wrapped in discomfort. So here's the question that starts before answers. Come if the crowd no longer holds up your identity, who stands in your place? This question doesn't resolve quickly, and the next stage sharpens it even more. Who are you when no one is confirming you? This is where illusion begins to shatter. When a woman steps away from groups, external affirmation is usually the first to fade. There are fewer reactions, fewer easy signals that she is on the right path, less emotional feedback, less applause for growth that hasn't yet become visible. Without that mirror reflecting her back, a deeper question arises almost immediately. If no one is reflecting me back to myself, who am I now? The Bible treats identity with profound seriousness, but it approaches it in a way quite distinct from today's cultural emphasis on self-expression. Within Scripture, identity is not something simply uncovered by showcasing who you are. Instead, it is tested in moments of solitude, sharpened through acts of obedience, and revealed gradually over time. Take Ruth, for example. She steps away from everything familiar behind her, without receiving a tidy, reassuring speech about who she is or will become. Her journey forward is shaped by vulnerability, risk, and everyday commitment. This path isn't celebrated for glamorous independence. It is uncertain, and demands deep sacrifice. Yet, it is precisely here that identity stops being defined by inherited circumstances and begins to form through lived loyalty and personal choice. This is why this stage of spiritual growth feels so deeply intimate. When one steps away from communal identity, spirituality becomes simpler, but this simplicity can feel threatening before it feels liberating. Without the presence of a group, there is no audience watching your devotion. No one is judging how well you pray or applauding emotional displays. Suddenly, your faith must stand firm, even when it isn't reflected back at you. Many women discover at this point that what seemed like strength was actually a product of being visible. What felt like certainty was just social reinforcement, and what appeared as peace was often the relief of moving along with the crowd. This realization isn't about condemnation, it's about revelation. In practical terms, this transformation changes how a woman lives. She becomes aware of how often she preemptively explained herself before anyone asked. She learns to pause before agreeing automatically. She grows more cautious about what she allows others to access in her life. These changes ripple out, reshaping relationships, altering energy reserves, adjusting routines, and influencing the commitments she chooses to take on. This kind of growth isn't flashy or dramatic. It doesn't make for attention-grabbing stories on social media. But it is authentic and profound. One moment from the Gospel stands out starkly in this context. Jesus asks, "Who do people say that I am?" And then presses further, "But who do you say that I am?" In a culture dominated by public opinion and social honor, this shift is revolutionary. Jesus moves the focus from reputation and consensus toward personal revelation and conviction. A similar shift can happen when a woman no longer belongs to a community in the same way. Public answers become insufficient. Inherited identities lose their hold. She must draw from somewhere deeper to respond. And this brings us to one of the most challenging transitions of all. When identity is no longer sustained by applause, faith itself changes its tone. It's important to pause here because this stage is often misunderstood. When a woman steps out of the group's energy, her faith may begin to sound unfamiliar, even to herself. The phrases that once came naturally now feel awkward or rehearsed. The spiritual language that was once her own starts to feel borrowed. Certain responses seem polished. Certain spiritual habits feel vulnerable under scrutiny. For many, this sparks anxiety. The immediate assumption is that faith is deteriorating. If the familiar expressions fade, they conclude that belief must be weakening. Scripture doesn't always view disruption as mere loss. Often, it sees disruption as a form of refinement. Faith rooted in the Bible rarely springs up first in the midst of a crowd, even though crowds may gather around it later. Take Abraham. He listens to a calling without any committee endorsement. Hannah offers prayers so raw and honest that even the religious leaders misinterpret her words. Mary accepts a divine mission that no community group could have approved before it happened. These stories aren't about rejecting community. Rather, they highlight a crucial truth. Conviction often arises before it gains collective recognition. Without the comfort of the group, faith loses some of its smoothness but gains depth and authenticity. Doubts grow louder because there's no echo chamber to absorb them. Questions stop feeling embarrassing, since there's no need to perform or pretend. Initially, this can feel risky and unsettling. Yet, faith that's never tested tends to be more fragile than belief that's been carefully examined. The Bible doesn't celebrate skepticism just for the sake of doubting, nor does it condemn every question outright. Instead, it honestly records moments of lament, preserves confusion, and honors people who remain connected to God even when deeply unsettled. This shift transforms daily life in ways many people don't openly acknowledge. Prayer ceases to be a formal event and instead becomes quieter, woven seamlessly into ordinary moments. A woman might find herself speaking to God while driving, folding laundry, or lying awake in the night. Bible reading focuses less on covering large amounts of text, and more on truly dwelling in a single sentence to internalize its meaning. This process encourages emotional honesty, but can also bring unresolved pain to the surface. The scriptures don't promise instant solutions. Rather, they refuse to quiet sincere souls seeking truth. Consider the moment when many followers walked away after Jesus shared a hard teaching. The narrative doesn't dramatize this as a great spectacle. It simply notes the thinning of the crowd. Then Jesus turns to those still present and asks if they want to leave too. Peter's reply isn't flawless theology, it's a raw, honest expression of need. Where else would we go? This is what faith sounds like when it can no longer rely on the language of the majority, less polished, but more grounded and true. So here's the central question for this stage: if all the shared words and phrases were gone, would your faith still know how to speak? The answer might not come right away. But what emerges next usually changes everything. Often, this clarity is the real turning point, more so than the initial breaking away. When the noise quiets and faith loses its borrowed vocabulary, clarity begins to unfold. Yet, whether in scripture or life, clarity rarely comes gently at first. It doesn't flatter, it reveals. A woman begins to see what had always been there, but was overlooked because she was focused on staying included. Patterns come into focus. Some relationships were maintained more out of convenience than genuine depth. Some beliefs inherited but never deeply examined. Some routines that had become mere substitutes for real purpose. What she once called loyalty may have simply been fear. What she referred to as peace might have been avoidance. The Bible often contrasts clarity with prestige, showing us that true understanding doesn't come from places of power or recognition. Take Moses. For instance, he didn't gain insight while living in Pharaoh's palace. Instead, he found it far from the systems that once defined him. The setting matters deeply. Shepherding, after all, wasn't glamorous. It was lowly work. Repetitive, undone, celebrated. Yet, it's precisely in this humble context that discernment begins to sharpen. Not because being obscure has some magic, but because when affirmation fades, attention sharpens. For a woman navigating this stage, she becomes sharply aware of the cost of denying hurt to herself. She notices how many times she said yes out of fear of being misunderstood. How often she swallowed the truth because honesty felt too costly socially. How many times she stayed in spaces that kept her visible, but small. This isn't a phase of blame, it's an awakening. But awakening wears you out. Emotional honesty demands more rest than mere performance ever did. In everyday life, clarity starts reshaping boundaries. Certain conversations no longer feel harmless. Certain environments lose their neutrality. Dynamics that once seemed normal now feel draining. Prayer might become shorter, scripture reading slower. A woman might find herself less interested in spiritual noise and more concerned with truth itself. This is why the story of the man born blind stands out as a powerful biblical example. Once he gained sight, He can't go back to speaking the way the religious authorities want. They try to fit him into their system, but his clarity resists shrinking back into borrowed words. He argues not by winning debates but by speaking from lived experience. In a world ruled by hierarchy and religious gatekeepers, such clarity disrupts the status quo. So, let me ask you plainly, what did you only begin to notice when you stopped striving to be agreeable? Clarity usually costs comfort, but an even deeper cost lies beyond that, because once you see clearly, grief often follows. This grief is what comes when belonging changes shape, and it's what many are least prepared for. People assume walking away from a group will bring relief. Sometimes it does, but often what follows is grief. Not overt sorrow or dramatic despair, but a quiet take that settles after the adrenaline fades. A woman begins to recognize that some connections were meaningful but not mutual, that some were warm but conditional, that some were close only as long as she stayed recognizable in the old way. The Bible never promises emotional ease and obedience. Abraham left with a promise, yes, but he still left. Naomi returned with God's presence but returned emptied. Scripture speaks honestly about the cost of transitions that are right in spirit but emotionally taxing. This honesty matters. It reminds women that grief doesn't mean they made the wrong choice. Grief, in real life, often sneaks up in tiny, unexpected moments. It might be triggered by a fleeting memory, an old group photo, or a phrase that once made her feel connected in part of something. Then there's the sudden, sharp awareness that life presses on relentlessly even without her. This realization can cut deeper than she expects. It can awaken self-doubt, shake her sense of self-worth, and tempt her to return, not because going back is right, but simply because it's familiar. This stage takes a toll on motivation and emotional energy. Some days she feels lighter, almost free. Other days, a heavy sadness weighs her down. She may wonder why freedom never quite feels as pure or clean as she imagined it would. Yet, in this difficult space, the Bible offers her a precious gift: language for sorrow that doesn't negate faith. The Psalms, though sung in communal worship, are filled with deeply personal expressions of grief. Faith doesn't erase pain, it teaches her how to hold it, where to place it. Mary at the tomb becomes a powerful figure here. Her grief is so overwhelming, her pain so raw, that she mistakes the resurrection for ordinary work. But Jesus doesn't start by explaining everything. Instead, he calls her by name. This small detail reveals a vital truth in Scripture. Grief isn't always resolved through facts or information. Sometimes, healing comes through being recognized and seen in your pain. This brings us to a transformative question. What if the sadness isn't evidence that she left wrong, but proof that something real and meaningful was lost, now simply taking a new form? When grief is acknowledged and honored, rather than denied, something stronger begins to emerge: a sturdier foundation that loosens the grip of societal consensus. After grief settles, a quieter, deeper force begins to form: conviction. Not the loud kind that debates endlessly, nor the brittle kind that needs constant defense. True conviction tends to be less showy but infinitely more substantial. While consensus is a social agreement, conviction is something inner and personal. The Bible clearly distinguishes between the two. In the ancient world, agreeing with a group often meant safety. Stepping out was risky, threatening honor, opportunity, or even survival. That's why Daniel's story is so important. He's not depicted as a flamboyant rebel, but as disciplined, calm, and quietly resolute. Scripture doesn't make him larger than life. It shows him inwardly grounded. This distinction is key. When a woman no longer lets consensus govern her, life doesn't necessarily get easier. It becomes more coherent. She finds herself less dependent on reading the room. She stops revising every word mid-sentence, no longer scanning faces for approval. At first, lacking that external validation feels isolating, even lonely. But gradually, it feels purer, clearer. Conviction begins to organize her from within, giving her a sense of self that no longer requires constant external permission. This impacts decisions more deeply than she might realize. She says no without feeling the need to justify herself with lengthy explanations. She rests without baptizing her rest in exhausted defense. She chooses differently, even when her decisions puzzle others. This approach can influence relationships, finances, service, tolling, and emotional stamina. The Bible doesn't label this behavior as selfish. Instead, it views it as stewardship of the soul. Take the example of Paul confronting Peter, one of the clearest illustrations of this dynamic. Paul's concern isn't about communities existing. Rather, it's about how fear of people begins to compromise integrity. Consensus pressures truth into inconsistency. Conviction doesn't aim to create drama. It steps in to restore alignment. This pattern remains relevant today. So the crucial question becomes, if approval disappeared tomorrow, what would still shape your life? As that answer begins to emerge, the story takes a surprising turn. Genuine conviction doesn't make community impossible. It actually makes community possible, but on new terms. Returning without losing yourself. One of the biggest twists in this entire journey is understanding that stepping away and reshaping oneself doesn't mean cutting ties with community forever. Scripture rarely portrays solitude as a final destination. Instead, it's a season, and like all seasons, it changes. What shifts isn't whether she needs people, it's how she belongs among them. Biblical examples of return never show simple reversals. Take Jacob. He returns, but not as the same person who left. Context matters deeply. He steps back into a world filled with memories, lineage, unresolved tensions, and social expectations. Scripture doesn't sugarcoat the difficulty of this. Returning means integrating what's changed, not pretending to be innocent of it. For a woman re-entering group identity after time apart, the experience feels different. She senses group dynamics with sharper clarity. She notices when the room tries to pull her back into performance mode. She hears unspoken expectations more quickly than before. But she also carries more compassion, a distance that reveals how fear and fragility often underpin many group behaviors. She becomes less judgmental but also less absorbable. Practically speaking, her participation changes. She listens without internalizing every word. She contributes without losing herself in function. She serves, but doesn't make service her entire identity. Burnout decreases because her worth isn't tied to constant availability. Her joy becomes less flashy but more stable. The post-resurrection appearances of Jesus embody this same energy. He doesn't simply restore old patterns as if nothing has happened. He returns with relationships reframed, same people, but with deeper connection, same bonds, but centered differently. Scripture suggests that mature belonging doesn't ask you to erase what solitude has taught you. Rather, it invites you to bring that integrity back into relationship. So here's the defining question of this phase. Can you step back into community without giving up the self that God has revealed to you in secret? If your answer is yes, then something profound is already unfolding. Because beneath healthier belonging lies an even more significant shift. Authority has moved. When the loudest voice no longer comes from outside you, that's when transformation reaches its deepest level. After the stages of separation, grief, gaining clarity, firm conviction, and wiser entry, a woman begins to sense that authority no longer lies externally in the same way. This isn't about pride or adopting a no one can challenge me attitude. True maturity doesn't look like that. It's more subtle. She becomes aware of whose voice she actually chooses to obey. In Scripture, authority often starts as something external: law, elders, prophets, tradition, structure. These were necessary to preserve a people. But the biblical narrative also shows a movement inward, with the law in not just on tablets but on the heart. Guidance shifts from being only received from the outside to being discerned within through relationship with God. In ancient, hierarchical societies, this was radical, and it remains so today. For a woman who no longer depends on group approval, this inward authority feels both grounding and unsettling. She pauses before reacting. She asks herself alignment questions before seeking approval. She no longer treats others' certainty as automatic direction. This doesn't make her infallible, it makes her accountable. And accountability carries a weight heavier than dependence. This shift changes daily practice. She stops consulting 10 people before making every serious decision. Prayer moves away from seeking echoed permission and toward honest listening. This can build emotional stability but also surface fear, as stronger inner authority weakens excuses. She can no longer easily blame the room for her choices. When Jesus tells his followers that the Spirit will guide them into truth, the timing is crucial. He says this before he will no longer be physically present in the same way. This promise of guidance is precisely for the time when external reassurance will grow scarce. It's not abandonment, it's preparation. So the inevitable question emerges when no one is directing you. Whose voice do you trust most? The answer will shape what solitude becomes next. Because eventually, something even stranger happens. Solitude stops feeling like deprivation. This realization often arrives quietly, without fanfare. One day, the silence doesn't feel hostile anymore. The room no longer feels accusing. Time stops stretching out in a frightening way. What once seemed like proof that something was missing now feels like enough space for something deeper to breathe. Scripture doesn't describe this stage with grandeur, but with steady, unshakable presence. David's Psalms stand as a vivid testament to lives marked by instability, relentless pursuit, loss, and uncertainty. In these Psalms, solitude isn't painted as a mere aesthetic choice, it's portrayed as a vital necessity. Over time, this necessary solitude evolves into a lived experience of solitude. This transformation doesn't come because dangers disappear, but because trust begins to take root in a soil where evidence of security is scarce. For a woman molded by such a journey, calm gradually supplants panic, not flawlessly, but distinctly. She no longer feels the urge to fill every silent moment compulsively. Instead, she begins to observe her thoughts without instantly acting on them. Her emotional responses become more regulated, more steady. Waiting ceases to be perceived as a waste. Stillness sheds any association with laziness, and even boredom turns into a revealing experience rather than an unbearable torment. These shifts have tangible effects on mental health. There are fewer impulsive choices and less frantic over-explaining. There's an increased tolerance for moments that remain unresolved. Solitude stops being a condition to endure and becomes one to nurture and manage. This is not detachment from life, as the Bible presents it, but a deep-seated trust that enables presence without the desperate need to blunt reality with distractions. The phrase "be still and know" carries profound weight here, particularly when understood in its original context. It is not an invitation to an idyllic retreat but a command issued amid chaos and upheaval. This stillness is far from passivity. It represents a spiritual stance that refuses to allow chaos to control one's reality. Solitude, then, is not the absence of struggle but the ground where struggle ceases to define one's identity. When this shift occurs, the next phase unfolds almost naturally. When being alone loses its fear-inducing power, purpose begins to emerge quietly, speaking without the need for an audience. Purpose starts to manifest in a way that is softer than ambition yet stronger than fleeting motivation. A woman no longer desperate for validation begins to recognize her purpose as something different, not grandiose, not hinged on being observed while doing meaningful acts, but a clear, steady next step that holds value without requiring applause. The Bible often cloaks purpose in the shadows of obscurity. Joseph's story is one such example, interpreting dreams while confined, long before he stands at the center of political power. Ancient prisons were not simply strategic waiting rooms. They were places where people vanished. Yet Scripture teaches that true purpose matures precisely when practiced without recognition. This understanding transforms how a woman channels her energy. She becomes less drawn to loudness and more devoted to faithfulness. She willingly engages in work that does not lend itself to selfies or public acclaim. Depth takes precedence over the breadth of reach, and meeting triumphs over momentum. Whether this shapes her career, ministry, creative pursuits, rest, or relationships, the external form might shift, but the internal attitude remains unwavering. At this stage, purpose no longer competes with ego. There is no need for universal understanding to validate it, nor an expectation of immediate results to keep it sacred. While the Bible does not dismiss visible success, it consistently highlights fruitfulness as faithfulness rather than size. Parables about stewardship when the master is away are deeply relevant here. The main point isn't about being visible to others, but about being trustworthy when no one is watching. Purpose in Scripture is often proven away from supervision, which is why it grows quietly yet powerfully at the same time. Now, consider the question that tests whether your purpose has truly matured. If nobody ever praised or acknowledged what you're building, would you still believe it's worth dedicating your life to? This question uncovers whether your purpose rests on truth itself rather than on external recognition. And once that foundation is secure, the final layer emerges freedom. Freedom of the kind that no longer seeks anyone's permission. I want to be cautious here because this stage can easily be misunderstood. This freedom isn't rebellion. It's not emotional detachment or disdain toward others or community. Instead, it's a quiet state of no longer needing approval to become the person God has been shaping all along. Scripture often shows that this freedom arrives after a long process of internal growth, rather than a sudden breakthrough. For example, Paul writes about freedom to communities still facing pressure, hierarchy, and conflict. The context matters. He doesn't tell them to reject all laws, but to live from conviction instead of fear. Freedom sharpens responsibility, it never erases it. For a woman who is no longer tied to group identity, this freedom feels steady and sure. She's no longer swollen by inclusion or crushed by exclusion. Opinions lose some of their grip. Silence no longer feels scary. She can approach others without losing herself, and step away without drowning in guilt. This balance isn't automatic. It's the result of long, unseen work. Daily life transforms under this freedom. There's less overthinking and fewer mental rehearsals. Decisions still carry weight, but they become clearer. Emotional energy isn't wasted on trying to manage imaginary permissions. The Bible doesn't promise this makes life simple, but it offers something better: peace that endures even within complexity. When Jesus says, "The truth will set you free," the context matters deeply. He was speaking to people who believed they were already free, which means biblical freedom often begins by exposing unseen chains people had stopped noticing. Freedom doesn't always mean removing visible barriers. Sometimes it means loosening invisible agreements that quietly controlled your life for years. So here's the final question. What would really change if you stopped seeking permission to become who God has quietly been forming you to be? You don't have to say it out loud, but if the answer stirs deeply inside, then you already know something important. This journey was never about leaving groups. It was about meeting yourself before God without the noise deciding your identity. Perhaps the most profound transformation of all is this: stepping away didn't diminish your faith. Instead, it revealed whether your faith truly belonged to a room full of people or directly to God. It didn't erase who you are. Rather, it peeled away the layers of yourself that were constructed merely to survive the weight of collective expectations. It didn't shatter your sense of purpose. It refined it. What remains after all of this is not emptiness, but ownership of your beliefs, your silence, your calling, and the woman God has been quietly shaping beneath all the performance, pressure, and noise. So maybe the real question was never, "Why did I step away?" Instead, it might have always been, "Who was waiting for me when I finally became still enough to see clearly?" If these words are resonating with your current journey, please share in the comments which part feels most personal to you. And if you know someone quietly navigating this kind of separation without a name for it, consider sharing this video with her. Subscribe to the channel and stay tuned for the next message, where we will dive even deeper into what unfolds when a woman stops chasing belonging and begins protecting the sacred work God is doing in secret. Sometimes, the holiest act God performs is not adding more voices, but narrowing the path until your own soul can hear Him clearly.